introduction. Let me share the screen. Is my screen visible, madam?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So firstly, I would like to thanks NPT, especially Kamal sir, Datle sir, Padmaja madam for giving me this wonderful opportunity. It's my privilege and pleasure. And thanks Indira madam for giving this nice introduction. So it's time that we go through the ICMR National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Participants 2017, which forms the epitome of research ethics guidelines in the Indian context. Please pardon me for switching off the video for the moment. It's just giving some flickers. Some technical issues might be. I will on the video after the presentation. So I will go through how the ICMR ethical guidelines had evolved over time, and we will go through the various sections of the 2017 ICMR ethical guidelines, and we will also see how the ethical guidelines were tweaked and modified during the COVID-19 pandemic, and a glimpse of the recent ethics guidelines on artificial intelligence and other salient points. So a very brief timeline, how ICMR ethical guidelines came into place and what was the evolution process in the Indian context. In the year 1980, the first ICMR ethical guidelines were published, and this was the first time in the country that the concept of ethics committee, informed consent and clinical trials, these were published in considering the global scenario of research ethics, because we know that the 1979 during that time the Belmont report got published, and keeping pace with the international context in ethics, in 1980 in India the first ethical guidelines on human research were published. Subsequently, down the line, after 20 years, in 2000, the ethics guidelines were updated. So the next update came in 2006, and finally there was a further need of an update in line with the international progress and developments, because the SIOMS guidelines of the World Health Organization, the federal policy, and the common rule, which were all revised during the late phase of the 2016-17 onwards, and that warranted an uniformity across international guidelines for to enable researchers to perform multi-center and multinational clinical research. So keeping in pace with the international development, in 2017 these guidelines were published, and which are applicable to all biomedical, social and behavioral science research involving human participants and their biological materials or data in India. So these are the 12 sections of the ICMR research ethics guidelines. So we will go in a brief about in a nutshell about the crux of the key content of these guidelines. So the ones in red, responsible conduct of research, public health research, socio-behavioral research, and research during humanitarian emergency. These are the newly added sections which are not there in the earlier 2006 guideline. The first section talks about the general principles of research. So what are the conditions that need to be satisfied before embarking into a research? So you all know about the principle of essentiality, voluntariness, non-exploitation, social responsibility, etc. So just to have a brief idea that this is absolutely essential for the investigator to conduct this research, and these are the prefixed criteria which has to be fulfilled to ensure the safeguard and right of the human participants and volunteers taking part in the research. The next section talks about the general principles in research, that for every research, it has to do a benefit risk assessment and a distributive justice. That means the fruits of the research has to be shared among the research participants and the community which has actually volunteered to take part in the research. Apart from that, it talks about ancillary care, community engagement, and the other points which we will discuss subsequently, like the informed consent process, compensation, payment for participation, and post-research access. That means once the research is over or once the particular project is over, how the benefits of that particular project or the research can be transmitted to the participants even beyond the completion of the research. The third section, in this particular section, it also talks about the categories of risk. Please note that in the earlier ICMR guidelines, there were 3 categories of risk, and now we have 4 categories of risk. And by risk, we mean physical risk, psychological risk, social, economic, and legal risk. The 4 categories of risk are less than minimal, minor increase in minimal or low risk, and high risk. Any interventional study is classified to be a high-risk research, and this table gives some examples of certain scenarios and their corresponding risks. It also talks about benefit sharing, which I told that the participants, their families, or their communities should also receive the fruits of research in terms of a financial and non-financial benefits. And the benefits should be maximized so that there should be a distributive justice. The next section talks about the responsible conduct of a research, and we all know that this warrants the qualifications and the eligibility of the research of the researchers and the shared values of research, where the research will be conducted, whether that particular institute or facility has the policy and the scope of conducting a research, and it starts from the review process of the inception of a research till the publication stage. And whenever there is a multicentric research or a multi-center research, ICMR gives the provision that one ethics committee can be designated as the leading ethics committee, and the other ethics committee can also evaluate, taking into consideration the local ethical issues, and monitors and conduct the research in the site-specific issues. So it is also mandatory to register clinical trials prospectively in the Clinical Trial Registry of India. The next section talks about the composition of the ethics committee and the functionalities of ethics committee. I won't go into the details because Chandrasekhar sir has given an elaborated deliberation on the composition of the ethics committee, what is the ICMR requirement for the various positions and their qualifications and eligibility. And what are the ethical issues pertaining to the review of a research protocol? Every research protocol is evaluated based on the social values, the benefit risk assessment, the compensation and the payment for the participants, and it should not be undue, which should have unduly attracted the participant for taking part in a research which is otherwise not helpful for them. Then disclosure of community potential conflict of interest, community engagement in research, and also the ethics committee has under its purview to look into the scientific aspects of the studies as well, beyond looking into the ethical perspectives like the scientific design, the scientific integrity and robustness as well. So for the quorum requirements, a minimum of 5 members need to be present for the meeting, and quorum should include both medical, non-medical, and non-technical and technical members. Minimum 1 non-affiliated member should be present, and preferably the lay person should be a part of the quorum. This is a very important topic for the postgraduate point of view for the examinations as well. So as I mentioned, the ethical issues pertaining to the review of a protocol, it looks into the scientific aspect as well as the ethical aspect. And the ethical aspect is not only limited to the individual participant, but also to their families, their communities. And it also not only is limited to their individual participation, but also to their data, their samples, or their stored materials. So it starts from the ethical aspect, starting from the inception of the research, the conduct during the informed consent procedure, conflict of interest, and as well as during the process of dissemination of the results. So while we talk about the informed consent process, all this section has been adequately covered. So we all know that an informed consent document contains an patient information sheet and an informed consent form. In the patient information sheet, the details of the research are explained so that the participant or the volunteer understands it completely and has the opportunity to ask the questions, and after that he or she voluntarily signs and takes an informed decision. So for the children, there is a special requirement which is called as assent. For less than 7 years of age, there is no need to document any assent. But for children between 7 to 12 years of age, a verbal or oral assent must be obtained. But for children between 12 to 18 years of age, a written assent is required, which has also to be signed by the parents or the legally authorized representatives. And designing an assent form is also an art. So it always has to be made in a very child-friendly manner. The use of cartoons and designs are more encouraged so that they can understand the research and the purpose of the research activity. So there is a separate document for biomedical research involving children, but the crux I have already explained. So there is, in certain scenario, the ethics committee has the right to give a waiver for a particular research project, waiver of informed consent, where like a research cannot be carried out without waiver for retrospective studies, for studies, anonymized biological samples, where the data is already available in an anonymized manner in a public domain, like doing studies on a publicly available registries, or doing a systematic review and meta-analysis using publicly available data, etc. The ICMR 2017 guidelines has added a newer section, which is known as a deception in research. And it talks about a certain kind of behavioral research where the activities of the research participant might be altered if the participant knows the actual purpose of the research, and which might contaminate and alter the findings. So in order to avoid that, this gives a certain provision to the researchers or the investigators not to disclose or partially disclose the actual purpose of the research, so that their behavior is not altered and impact the research findings. Of course, the ethical issues and the nitty-gritties has to be fulfilled, and under no circumstance should the participants be exploited. So under deception comes active deception, incomplete deception, or authorized deception. The next section talks about dealing with vulnerable population. In the exams, examiners do ask about what do you mean by a vulnerable population. If in one sentence, if we answer that those participants or volunteers who are not in a position to give an informed consent, or who had their compromised autonomy. So, for example, socially, economically, or politically disadvantaged groups of individuals who have other strong influence by their employers, etc. So, where the voluntariness or understanding is compromised due to their situation, they comes under vulnerable population, and the ethics committee has to look into the protection of the vulnerable population. The next section talks about interventional research, or for example, the clinical trials. Till ICMR, when ICMR actually published their guidelines, it was an ICMR National Ethical Guidelines. But when the new drugs and clinical trial rules 2019 had come, the NDCT rule has mentioned to follow ICMR National Ethical Guidelines, and by virtue of it, ICMR guidelines has become a rule, and it is mandatory to follow it. So for NDCT, there was a separate session, so I'm not going into the details. So it talks about also post-trial access and benefit sharing after a trial is over from the ethical point of view. The next section talks about public health research, and this is also a newly added section. And now the focus of research of biomedical clinical research in India is of implementation research. That means to implement the findings of a research in a real world public health scenario, or a setting, or a community setting. So in clinical trials, we understand about clinical equipoise, where the investigator is completely unsure of the benefits of one particular treatment arm. Likewise, in implementation research, to be very sacrosanct and to maintain the ethical integrity, it is important to know the contextual or the situation equipoise, where the investigator is absolutely unsure in which particular context will a particular intervention and its implementation will work. So while talking about public health research and implementation research, it also talks about community engagement, research collaboration, risk-benefit ratio, and dissemination of the findings and benefit sharing to the participants. The next section talks about socio-behavioral sciences research for health and safety. It also mentions that the confidentiality and of the research participants should be adequately maintained, and if socio-economically deprived people are taken, their rights and integrity has to be protected. The next section talks about genetic research and services. And we all know that the genetic test results, a disclosure of genetic test results, for example, in the neonates or for example, in fetus in utero, had severe societal implications. Therefore, maintaining the confidentiality and counseling by qualified persons before disclosing the results is important. And technology should not be misused, like to create a designer babies, gender selection, etc. The next section, so there is ICMR has a separate research guidelines on research on stem cell research, and this guideline is prepared in collaboration with the Department of Biotechnology, and every institution who have a stem cell research review committee for projects undergoing stem cell research. The next section talks about research involving stored sample or biobanking and datasets. For such type of research, we need to understand that any stored sample can be classified into three types, like anonymous or unidentified samples, where the identifiers are not present. Anonymized, that means a systemic de-identification procedure, which can be reversible or irreversible. And the third is the identifiable link, so where the actual identity of the donor of the sample can be traced back. So use of stored sample has to be deliberated properly. In many research, investigators write that we will collect blood and it can be used for a future research, but such type of blanket statement is not right, and it has to be mentioned for what exact purpose will the sample be used, and if it is used for certain other purpose than originally intended, then it is required to do a reconsenting procedure from the participant, and it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to foresee these issues. Next section talks about research during humanitarian emergencies and disasters. Like we know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, which had struck us recently, and ICMR had come up with a separate guidelines. And there a very important term like monitored emergency use of unregistered and experimental interventions, or MURI. That was a term which was used, like we have emergency drug authorization or emergency use authorization, which is not equal to a drug approval. So in these type of scenarios, the I think ethical committees has the certain flexibilities to allow the use of certain interventions which are not at all, which might not have been approved, but under a monitored and restricted use after following a scientific review, for the sake of tiding over a particular crisis. But even then, the scientific integrity, the ethical principles hold true, and under no circumstances should the participants be exposed to risks. So we did also discuss the various categories of research during COVID-19 pandemic. This is the last part of my presentation. Is the last week ICMR came out with the ethical guidelines for application of artificial intelligence in biomedical research. Now we know that artificial intelligence has come up in a huge way in various research activities. Even for writing, we know that ChatGPT has come up. So the ethical principles of medical artificial intelligence, starting from data privacy, starting from validity, technicalities, accessibility, etc. All these issues are given, and any research project which involves an artificial intelligence or machine learning tool has to give in details the technologies to be used and why it is mandatory to be used, and how the data safety and security of the participants will be maintained. So this has 17 such subsections. So there are some articles which also gives these ICMR ethical guidelines in a very brief. So one authored by Dr. Rolly Mathush, who has played a crucial role in drafting these guidelines. In one article, we wrote about the differences between 2006 and 2017 guidelines and the important steps and the important differences. So to conclude, so we know that ethical issues are updated as per international guidelines, and the ICMR 2017 guidelines has been updated as per the international requirement. It is the time that it needs a further update. And it talks about the newer issues like implementation research, broad consent, deception in research, and multi-center research. And these ICMR research guidelines is applicable to India, and it also sets a landmark for setting up ethical guidelines for doing research for other LMIC countries. And this has been widely disseminated and has been published widely, even in the International Compilation of Human Research Standards by the US Department. And it's the only ethical guidelines from a low middle income countries which has been published. So you can get more resources under the National Center for Disease Informatics and Research, where the ICMR Bioethics unit is in Bangalore. With this, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for your patient listening, and apologies I couldn't put the video on for a long time. It's giving some flickers. Thank you so much, and once more thanks to NPT for providing me this opportunity.
Dr. Rani Indra Sinha?
Yes, sir, I'm here. Dr. Sehbal Das has elaborated with great clarity, and he has also emphasized specific domains in biomedical and health research guidelines, encompassing national requirements in keeping with global standards. We have some questions, but I'm unable to see those questions. I was wondering if somebody could read those questions, because on the screen I have thank you, and it is not moving.
Yes, I will go ahead. Sir. I will go ahead. Sehbal Das, sir.
I got the question. The question is there, sir. Now I can read the question. How long or the time period a medical institution can have MOU of ethics committee with Dr. Suraj Panchal?
Yeah, so as we know that ICMR has told that when there is no ethical committee in one particular institute, we can have an MOU with a nearby medical college or facilities which is within a radius of 50 kilometers, but it has not given a specific time frame for it. So this time period thing is not clear as of now, like till how long it will go. But for any, if it is a medical institution, it is always advisable to have their own ethics committee in place, because it might embark into newer trials. It might go into post-graduation and courses, even sponsored clinical trials. So it is always advisable to start their own ethics committee. Instead, if it hasn't spoken about the exact time frame of it.
Okay, so the next question is it allowed to conduct academic trials related to MEURI? This is from Dr. Chaitanya.
Right. Thank you, madam, for this question. But we know that MEURI or MEURI is only applicable when there is a humanitarian emergency or a disaster, and it talks about unregistered intervention or an unauthorized intervention. So, of course, when such scenario is not there in a normal scenario, MEURI does not apply. So, ethics committee may not allow to give an intervention of an unapproved medication. So only if those conditions are fulfilled, like there is a humanitarian emergency or we don't have any approved treatment in place, but there is some data that this treatment might working, then there is a question. But in normal circumstance, it is out of context, and it is the question actually does not arise. But thanks for this interesting question.
Another question from Dr. Himanshu: which guidelines we should follow, Indian GCP or ICMR?
See, both are in, I would say that both are in harmony. So ICMR ethics guidelines were developed, and we also have the Indian GCP, we have the NDCT rule. So all are in harmony. There is not much of a contradiction. There are maybe a fewer additional points which are covered by some other guidelines. For example, like to give an example, ethics committee from the requirement of a women member, that has been given in NDCT, but not in ICMR guidelines. So likewise, all these GCP guidelines or ICMR ethical guidelines, these are not in contradiction. And to further say that ICMR ethical guidelines is more overarching, and it talks about basic science research, observational studies, and clinical trials, whereas the GCP is more of a clinical research per se.
We have another very interesting question from Dr. Chitra. Can IEC of Medical College give clearance to research from other medical colleges like Ayurvedic or homeopathic?
So research actually doing on the Ayush products doesn't come under DCGI. Even the Ayush ministry is completely different. So it is I mean, although it is not clearly mentioned, but what procedures are usually followed is like, since every ethics committee needs to have experts from that particular domain. So in our ethical committees, like the way where I say, as based on the ICMR national ethical guidelines, when an ethical committee is pool is formed, the members often might not have the qualifications from a Ayush point of view, like their products and their interventions. So there has been some instances where the approvals were given, but preferably these things should be dealt in those institutions which are directly linked with the Ayush Ministry, instead of the ones which are linked with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare.
A question from Dr. Pandey. They have a provisional registration which is going to expire. Do they have to reapply for permanent registration?
So provisional registration from ICMR, are you referring to that registration of ethics committee from DHR?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so if that is so, you have to renew.
And the final question, sir, role of a lay person in ethics committee.
Yeah, so as all of us know that preferably the word which is mentioned, preferably the lay person should form a quorum. But in our experience, often lay person doesn't have much opinion or doesn't or goes with the flow. So as per if you see the requirement of the quorum, it mentions preferably the lay person should have an opinion, and he or she should be encouraged to give his or her opinion, and preferably should be a part of the program. So what preferably is given in the ICMR ethical guidelines.
So that is all, sir.
Thank you so much, madam. Even if there are further questions, we can take those in the subsequent emails, and we will always get back.
Okay, sir. Now we are at the end of the today's session. I am very thankful to both the speakers, Dr. Chandrasekhar K. sir, as well as Dr. Saibal Das sir, for their excellent, concise and conceptual presentation, as well as moderator Dr. Khatra madam and Dr. Sina madam for their nice moderation. Lastly, my sincere thanks to all participants for their active participation and patience hearing. Now with this, I declare that today's session is over, and we will meet again for the last session on 30th March at 3 p.m. Thank you all.